Good afternoon, Tzaharaim Tovim. This week our Parsha is Parshat VaYishlach, and I've entitled it, How Do We Recalibrate in the Midst of Tribulations? So as you know, and as I have said often, my great love in being a Limudei Kodesh person, a Jewish studies individual, academic, teacher, learner, is bringing together critical texts, critical issues, and people. And how do we interface and intersect? And of course, as we are reading about these families with their separations and their fractures and their attempted reconciliations or resolutions or lack thereof, it's obvious that in terms of the times that we're living right now, as we are in the midst of this horrible war, we are struggling for the basic elements of our very humanity. And I find so much of that reflected in these texts. As my dear friend and very, very wise colleague says, Esther Toledano, those of us that look through the lens of the Tanakh or of Jewish thinking when we look at life come to situations with a certain gestalt. And that is how I see what is going on in our lives on so many levels. So with that, let's launch into a discussion of this week's Parsha. It's Haftarah, which comes from the shortest book of the Tanakh, the whole book of which we read as a Haftarah, but lowly dog, don't worry, when you go to Shul on Shabbat, it's very, very short, one chapter, 21 verses, that's the whole thing. And its application to our lives. We note that Yaakov is at a critical inflection point as we begin this Parsha. Just as today, there is so much talk about what does the day after look like when this war is at some point of whatever it will be at, in terms of what is going on in Israel and everything that is being confronted by our brethren and by all citizens of that region, Israelis, Palestinians, those of all religions, those of all ethnicities and nationalities. We begin to get a sense of what does it mean when we talk about that day after in Yaakov's life. There's been a 20-year separation of the twin brothers. They will now reacquaint themselves with each other. What do they remember? What is the narrative that they each bring with them from that separation? What has happened to change them? How have they evolved? Where are they each now? And how will their different life trajectories play into this moment in time? What is from their history? And what is presently the situation in front of them? The very questions we are dealing with in our lives today as Jews, as human beings, as part of Israel, as those concerned about this region in our world. We find the first words of quoted prayer in our Parsha, as uttered by Yaakov here. Vayomer Yaakov, Elokei Avi Avraham ve'Elokei Avi Yitzchak, Hashem ha'omer Elai Yashuv la'artzacha u'lemoladatecha va'ativa imach, evoking feelings of Avraham. And Yaakov says, O God of my father Avraham, and God of my father Yitzchak, who said to me, return to your land, return to your birthplace, and I will do good for you. Remember, he had to leave this land because of contention and his own safety at the request of his mother Rivka. He then enters the world of Lavan with its challenges from which he is now emerging. In short, he has lived a very different reality in the past 20 years. I have become small from all the kindnesses, katonti, mikol chasadim, mikol ha'emet asher asita et avadcha, and all of the truth that you have redeemed, you have used to redeem your servant. And now, I am even two camps. My family is that large. Now deliver me, hatzileni na, miyad achi, from the hand of my brother, umiyad Esau, from Esau, for I am afraid of him. Pan yavo v'hikani im ahabanim, that he should come and strike me and my children, my family, the women. Historical fears and precedents are part of the reunion, and they will temper how each party comes to this experience. Often, we know as human beings that when we have automatic reactions, we are responding to that history and the past, not necessarily the situation that is in front of us. Before we give the person standing in front of us a chance, we run the reel of that history in our minds. How do we remain simultaneously guarded and protected, which we should, while also considering new possibilities? This is what I believe has been so incredibly difficult for all of us in today's reality. And I would suggest that this is a dynamic we should all think about. And you, God said, the text continues in verse 13, I will surely do good with you, and I will make your seed as numerous as the sand of the sea, that you won't even be able to count them. Again, this is evoking and a refrain, a pismon, if you will, of the promise God had made to Abraham in the beginning. Within his tribulations, we see a type of coming to terms with self, as Yaakov and God work through their relationship. It is here that Yaakov will find his strength to go on and forge a future that perhaps might be a different story than the real in his head of the past ones, not to mention perhaps some sense of regret regarding his own actions. Aviva Zornborg teaches us important lessons about holding on to faith to turn our past into our future in a positive direction. Abraham did this, Yitzchak did it in some way, and now it is Yaakov's turn. Aviva teaches. Yaakov returns to the Holy Land after 20 years of absence. Return proves to be a complex experience of confrontations, of deaths and disasters. His first act as he re-enters the Holy Land is to send messengers to his estranged brother Esau, asking for peace and bringing gifts of reconciliation. Fearful for his life, he prays to God, the first quoted prayer in our Torah, and simultaneously prepares for war. And during the night, before meeting Esau with his 400 men, Yaakov encounters this mysterious party with whom he wrestles all night until the sun rises and he limps toward his brother. This brief survey of the tribulations afflicting Yaakov on his return, including others regarding his daughter Dinah and the sons Shimon and Levi and their vengeful actions against Shem and other things that will occur, casts a shadow over God's promise to Yaakov as he left the land 20 years earlier. In his dream at Bet El, Yaakov hears God saying, I will bring you back to this land. And on waking, he has vowed his response to the promise. If God remains with me, if God protects me, if I return b'shalom, safely to my father's house, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's abode. In his vow, Yaakov adds b'shalom, to be safe, to be in peace, to be complete, to the word of God's promise. His concept of return involves an idea of wholeness. Now, let's turn to the relationship between the brothers. Here we note that as reconciliations go, we are making some progress within the historical context of the families of Bereshit. Vayisa Yaakov einav, Yaakov raises his eyes. V'yar, he looks. V'hine Esau ba, and Esau is coming toward him. V'imo arba ma'ot ish, and with him 400 men. So it is this point that he divides the children with Leah and with Rachel and the two maidservants. He creates the separate camps because he is fearful. He places the maidservants and their children first, and Leah and her children after, and finally Rachel and Yosef last. He then goes ahead of them. He bows to the ground 7 times until he comes close to his brother. V'yaratz Esau likvotav v'yichbekuhu. Remember that. V'yipol al tzavarav v'yishkehu v'yipchu. Esau runs toward his brother Yaakov. He embraces him, to hug. He falls on his neck, and he kisses him, and they wept. So in Bereshit Rabbah we learn that his compassion was so moved when he saw the hesitancy and the kavod with which Yaakov approached him. So he ran to hug him, that he was the instigator, the initiator of the physical contact. In the text of the Torah, over the words VaYishlach, there are these 2 dots. And every time these 2 dots appear, the Braita has to come in, the external Mishnah ought to have to come in and tell us something. So we're told that some of our Chazal, some of our interpreters, our sages tell us that it means that he did not kiss him wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, it is a well-known tradition that Esau hated Yaakov, but that his compassion was so moved at this time that he did kiss him wholeheartedly. That emotional reunion. So let's think about this. History clearly colors this meeting. Or is there another possibility? Maybe the differences are not obliterated, but somehow the absence of one's brother, of one's sibling, overrides the anger or the residual feelings of the differences. Perhaps we can even find a glimmer of hope for our own lives today, as people, as members of a nation, as individuals and families. I know I do feel the pain of fractured relationships in families of origin, and I respect that those people that want to maintain them. But it doesn't mean that you don't feel that absence. Esau says, I have plenty. There are some verses here where he says, look at what I've brought, I'll bring you gifts. Let you have, you take, you keep what you have. So maybe Yaakov is offering Esau something. Maybe he realizes that he did use trickery, that, he's responsible for part of this fracture, for much of this fracture, maybe. May I go out on a limb and say? And maybe he is trying to make it up to Esau. But Esau here says, Kan hodalo al habrachot. According to, again, Bereshit Rabbah, the Midrash on Bereshit, we learn that Esau has acknowledged that Yaakov had the right to the blessings. In other words, he's moved past his own anger and historical reel in his head. And then Yaakov and Esau have this interchange where he's saying, please, no, take these gifts. And then he says, which is so interesting, he says, I have seen your face, which is like the face of an angel, and you have accepted me. So one of the explanations of who Yaakov was wrestling with on that ladder is his own conscience is one, God or a messenger is another, and the other is maybe Esau. Maybe, as we said last week, there's a little bit of Yaakov and Esau and Yaakov, and you are looking at a mirror, and you are seeing everything that you yourself are. We learn in Vayikra when we say, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. It is not lost on us that resh ayin are both the words for neighbor and for ra, for bad. And one of our explanations of what it means is, when you look at another person, don't just see the good that you want to see reflected in that person, but see what maybe isn't so good in you, reflected in them, reflected in you. We're all human. We all have weaknesses. Give each other the benefit of the doubt. So he then goes on and he says, look, if I have found favor in your eyes, please take this gift from me, because I have seen your face and you have accepted me. The Midrash tells us that Yaakov sees this as a sign that Esau has let the historical experiences be bygones, and that this kind of reconciliation, not to obliterate past differences, but that somehow we can work at a different present reality. Again, a lesson of hope for all of us on so many levels, given what's going on in our world today. I love the notion, and this is sort of a take or an iteration of what Jonathan Sacks says, where sacred spaces where we make differences for each other. We also learn that peace is not about living in agreement with each other. It's dafka about making that specific space for differences, being able to negotiate them, being able to work through them, being able to maintain a relationship in which you acknowledge and you respect the other, and you each are your own people. In my multi-faith dialogue work and world, I often say I can do multi-faith dialogue, which a lot of my friends and folks in my religious Jewish world just don't quite get. But I'm going to go with Rambam here. I'm going to go with Maimonides, who says you can do it if you know who you are. So my line is, I know who I am when I walk in the room, I know who I am when I'm in the room, and I know who I am when I walk out of the room. And those of us that can do that work, it's very important that we do that work, especially today, because so many of those connections are coming to a screeching halt, unfortunately, because of what's going on in our world. Then Yaakov adds, kachna, that same word, lech lecha, kachna, lechna, that please take this gift, et birchati. And the word for gift here is used, blessing. Accept this blessing that I have brought for you, because God has favored me. Yeshli hakol, I have everything. And Yaakov prevails upon Esau. They are both being very, very kind to each other. They are each moving past those historical experiences, and they are trying to work toward some kind of recalibration of their relationship. It will not necessarily solve the tribulations. It doesn't make them go away. It doesn't remove the wrongdoings. But again, maybe we can forge a different future. At that point, he says, travel, we will go together, and I will go alongside you, with you. So we have some progress here, clearly from Cain and Abel, which didn't work out so well, right? Yitzchak and Yishmael, right? Not such a great model either. And here we have these two trying to figure out what to do and how to do it, not giving up their own identities, being true to themselves, and acknowledging that maybe we can fashion a different future. In our accompanying Haftarah, and I'm always going, by the way, with the conventional Haftarah for the Torah portions this year. If there's a Rosh Chodesh, I'm still going to go with the Haftarah that goes with the portion. In fact, when we get to one of our Parshiot later, we're going to find something very interesting, because we have one of our Haftarah that we do read this year that we often do not read, because that Shabbat is generally involved with Hanukkah, and we read a special Haftarah. So, but I want to stay with the Haftarah that are assigned to the Parshiot, because, again, going back to the theme or the idea from the very beginning, that Our Haftarah, historically, was a way for our people, when they were forbidden from reading Torah publicly, to evoke the messages of Torah through similar imagery, language, and messages. And then using that similar line of thinking to apply to today thematically. So in our Haftarah, we meet Ovadia, and we read the shortest book of the Torah. As with all of our prophets from which we read in our Haftarah, it is valuable to establish historical context. Ovadia is introduced to us in chapter 18 of Kings, Malachim Aleph, Kings 1. When Queen Isabel, was killing prophets, it was Ovadia who hid 100 of them in caves at his own personal risk, for which he was rewarded with the gift of prophecy himself. Chazal also teach that Ovadia was a convert from the nation of Edom, who were the descendants of Yaakov's brother, Esau. And this, I should tell you, happens often when we look at who comes from where. There's a lot in later history of bringing together members of disparate parts of families that were at war, who later figure it out and either come back or somehow reconcile or somehow work together for a goal that will be to their mutual benefit. Perhaps in Ovadia, we are finding this positive statement that shows us the bringing together of Yaakov and Esau, a process that took many, many generations and that began in our Parsha. It has been proposed that the Edom of Ovadia's prophecy can refer to the biblical nation of Edom and the First Temple era, to Rome and the Second Temple, which was destroyed by the Romans, or to the Christian world in general. Take your pick. God has sent a message about Edom, who will not fare very well, as the nations will go to war against her. Edom did not benefit, after all, when she let the evil in her heart seduce her into speaking out against Israel. They live in the cracks of the rocks of their high dwelling is taught to refer to the notion that Edom relies on the merits of our common and shared ancestors, Abraham and Yitzchak, that will not be enough to save them. We read in our Haftarah, Chazon Ovadia, the vision of Ovadia. So God says concerning Edom, we have heard tidings, Shmu'ah, Shamani, we have heard tidings, we have heard a tradition from God, and a messenger has been set amongst the nations. It says, arise and take them in war. Behold, hine, katon netaticha. Now this is also evokes, remember katonti, that we are small. Remember rega katan, a small moment. We are small in the face of history. And a lot of times when terrible things happen, and we can think of many, many, many examples, it's when people forget that each one of us is katan. Each one of us is little. And it is only through building bridges and building connections and working with others that we will establish ourselves as being greater than katan. But here, behold, I have made you small amongst the nations. This is to Edom. You are very despised. So our sages want to know, why is it that Ovadia is the one that prophesies to Edom only and no one else? So Chazal teach us Ovadia was an Edomite proselyte. God says, I will bring them forward. Let Ovadia, who dwelt between two wicked people, Achav and Isabel, and did not learn from their deeds, come and impose retribution upon Esau. So the thinking is, as Esau's generations go on, again, history is evoked, they were taking on the practices of others. They were acting in a way where they forgot they were small. They forgot who they were. Power got to them, and they acted inappropriately. And it is one of their own who is being chosen to remind them, A, of their roots, and B, where they went wrong. The wickedness of your heart, chapter 1, verse 3, enticed you. You tried to go up like an eagle. You tried to place a nest upon the stars. But God said, Oridacha, I will bring you down from there. It's like the Migdal Bavel, where the people of Bavel, what did they do that was wrong? They said, come, let us build a tower to God. We will go up. We will be like God. We will conquer God. We will be as great as God. No, that doesn't work out. And then we read in verse 6, Ve'ech nichpashu Esav niv'u mitzpanav. Esau is searched out. His hidden things are revealed. Now, Chazal, classical commentaries, will tell you Esau was wicked. If you have any questions about any of the wrongdoing that Yaakov did, it's because Esau basically had to be put in his place, and that this confirms it. I hesitate to even say that, but to be academically honest, I need to put it on the table. I also would suggest that, again, that goes back to painting things too much in black or white, and it misses the nuances and the real lessons of the story. Shall I not, verse 8, in that day, says God, destroy all from Esau? Your mighty people will be destroyed. Because of the violence of your brother Yaakov, shame will cover you, and you will be cut off forever. In other words, what you did to Yaakov is what it's saying. So, here's my question. Are we getting mixed messages here? Does this indicate that we cannot forget history, and here Ovadia is perhaps bringing us the notion that there is still a part of Esau that cannot be forgiven or move forward? This could be a most important lesson for all of us if we're listening. Further, we must consider that on both sides, there is the inability to move forward completely without the startle reflex that history and experience imprints upon us. And it goes on to report the things that are going to happen to Adam. For the day of God over all the nations is close. As you have done, kasher asita yaseh, as you have done to others when you forgot that you were just little and you tried to be one of the big power brokers and do all the abuses, this will be done to you. It will all come down on your head. And on Mount Zion there will be a remnant. And it is the house of Yaakov. Yershu Beit Yaakov et Morashehem. It is the house of Yaakov that will inherit it all. Note the symmetry between how the classical commentators want us to read the original narrative of Yaakov and Esau and the fate described here. The house of Esau shall become stubble. The house of Yaakov will be fire, and they will ignite them, and they will consume them, and there will be no survivors from the house of Esau. That's in verse 18. Is there any other way that we can look at this? How do we, as we suggested last week, see Esau and Yaakov not as completely separate and opposite and totally disconnected entities, but rather interlocked and containing elements of each other within themselves? Classical commentators want us to believe that the hug was not a hug, but an attack. He tried to strangle him, Esau, when he met him, when Yaakov was coming toward him. But can we accept the hug as a loving, compassionate hug? That is the language, by the way. Filled with regret over past contentions? Is that even possible? How do we find relevance today regarding these words and why they are attached to this Parsha? The obvious answer could be found in verse 18, which I just read, where Yaakov is elevated and Esau is demoted, if you will. However, this is not necessarily helpful in that if we have to depend on one party to fail in order for the other to succeed, as we know all too well, this does not produce a lasting, positive, or viable solution. So let's dig a little deeper. Just as this Parsha reflects Yaakov's tribulations, our Haftarah refers to those of another people who come from the same roots. Ovadia provides deep consolation for believers everywhere. As global Christians suffer trials of various kinds, in the New Testament, book of James, chapter 1, verse 2, they can rest content in a God of perfect justice, who will not let injustices committed against God's own people go unpunished in the long range. In the Rega Katan, in the small moment, at individual points in history, it may not feel that way, but we have to look at the bigger picture. So how do we internalize this message? Again, we're going to return for just a moment to Aviva Zornberg. Rashi quotes a classical midrash, Taryag. It has the value of the 613 commandments. I sojourned with Lavan, but I kept all 613 commandments and did not learn from Lavan's ways, as opposed to Esau, who goes, the Edomites go in other places and learn from the ways of others. In other words, it is encoded through the numerical total of 613 in his message to his brother, what he feels to be his real strength. The fact that his identity has remained the same, has remained intact, regardless of all the vicissitudes. And this is central to who we are. How do we, in our lives, interact with others while maintaining our sense of self and our own identity? It's very important to figure out how to interface those two elements, not lose one to the other. So what's our lesson? It's not simple. It's not linear, and it's not without angst. We must, lo tishkach, don't forget, we must not forget our history. And yes, that startle reflex is there. But at the same time, we must be open to new possibilities. We are living through this moment right now. We must guard ourselves in our camps, as did Yaakov, while acknowledging the pain and the residual feeling of having been wronged in the other, in Esau. How do we hold all these truths simultaneously, given that they are not congruent with each other, and not feel that we are collapsing under the weight of their differences? Those are the ongoing thoughts and considerations in my head every moment at this time. I believe, b'chol libi, with all my heart, and with full faith in God, we must all do our best to think about a new future in a new way, in order that Yaakov and Esau's détente, their hug, which should be taken as a hug, will not have been for naught. I know that's hard, but I also hold on to the truth that we are all God's children and that God is waiting for us to figure all of this out. Shabbat Shalom. And may we all continue prayers for all of Israel, for innocent Palestinians, and for all innocent victims of those who do not understand and do not acknowledge that we are all part of the human family. Lehitraot.